pretty predictable. I work at Bellwether's Books, a cosy little bookstore just a 5-minute walk from my apartment. I love my job. Surrounded by books all day, it's perfect for someone like me. I'm not exactly what you'd call a social butterfly. I prefer the company of a good story to a crowded party. My evenings are usually spent curled up on my sofa with a book or watching an old movie. It's a simple life, but it's my life, and I'm content. My apartment building, the Elmwood, is pretty much the same way. Predictable. It's an older building with thick walls and creaky floors, but it's quiet, and the neighbours are mostly friendly, if a little nosy. Mrs. Gable on the first floor always has cookies, and Mr. Henderson across the hall plays his classical music at a reasonable volume. We all kind of know each other's routines. It's comfortable. That comfortable routine got a little shaken up last week. A new neighbour moved into apartment 2B, right next to mine. I hadn't seen them move in, but I heard the movers. Lots of thumping and muffled voices. Later that day, I saw a notice on the building's bulletin board. "Welcome, Mr. Silas." It was handwritten with a little drawing of a house. Simple enough. The thing is, I started hearing things. Not noises from the apartment, not yet anyway. I heard whispers. Mrs. Gable, while handing me a slightly too sweet lemon cookie, leaned in and said, "He's a strange one, that Mr. Silas. Keeps to himself. Didn't even say hello when I offered him some of my famous apple pie. Mr. Henderson, while adjusting his hearing aid, chimed in. Saw him carrying a box full of, well, I don't know what. Looked heavy, and he was scowling. Definitely scowling. I tried to be polite. Oh, well, maybe he was just tired from the move, I offered, but their words planted a seed of unease. I'm not proud of it, but I'm easily influenced by other people's opinions, especially when it comes to things I don't know much about. And I knew nothing about Mr. Silas. The next day I saw him, or rather, I saw part of him. I was coming home from work, juggling my tote bag, full of books, of course, and my keys, when I glanced towards his apartment door. It was slightly ajar, and I could see a sliver of the room inside, just a dark, shadowy corner, and a figure, tall, stooped, standing perfectly still, just watching. I quickly looked away, my heart beating a little faster. I fumbled with my keys, finally got my door open and practically slammed it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, trying to calm my racing pulse. It's nothing, I told myself. He was probably just looking out the window, but the image of that still, shadowy figure stayed with me. That evening, I found myself being extra cautious. I kept my music low. I avoided going near the shared wall. I even peeked through my peephole a few times, just to make sure the hallway was clear. It was silly, I knew, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. The unsettling feeling grew. Every time I passed his door, I felt a prickle of nervousness. I started imagining things. Was that a floorboard creaking from his apartment? Was that a shadow moving behind his his closed blinds. It felt like the quiet, predictable world of the Elmwood had tilted slightly, and Mr. Silas was the reason why. He was the unknown element, the stranger next door, and my usually calm mind was filling with anxious questions. What was he doing in there? Why did he seem so different? Why was he always watching? My secure comfort was now replaced with a growing concern. The next few days were a blur of self-imposed awkwardness. I practically tiptoed past Mr. Silas's door, holding my breath, as if he could somehow sense my presence through the wood. I even started taking the stairs instead of the elevator, just to avoid any potential encounters in the confined space. It was ridiculous, I knew, but the unease had taken root. My imagination, usually a source of comfort, was now my enemy. Every little noise from 2B became amplified. A muffled cough, he was probably plotting something. The sound of something being dragged across the floor. He was, well, I didn't even want to think about what he might be dragging. One morning, I was rushing out to work, already late because I'd spent too long debating whether to wear the blue scarf or the green one. A crucial decision, obviously. As I hurried past 2B, the door suddenly opened. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was Mr. Silas. He was holding a grocery bag, and as he stepped out, the bag ripped. Oranges, apples, and a jar of what looked like pickles went tumbling across the hallway floor. My first instinct was to run, to pretend I hadn't seen anything and just keep going. But he looked so flustered. He was struggling to bend down, his face reddening with effort and, I assumed, embarrassment. "Oh, I stammered, my cheeks burning. Hesitation warred with a deeply ingrained sense of politeness. "Let me help you." It was a whisper, barely audible, but he heard me. He looked up, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. His eyes weren't menacing or scary, as I'd imagined. They were just tired and a little sad. I knelt down and started gathering the scattered groceries. I was careful to avoid touching his hand, my movements quick and jerky. As I picked up a particularly bruised apple, I noticed something else. A book had fallen out of the bag, its cover slightly torn. It was Pride and Prejudice, my favourite book. "Oh," I said, a little louder this time, a flicker of genuine surprise escaping me. You read Jane Austen?" He looked at the book, then back at me, a faint crease appearing between his eyebrows. "Yes," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Do you?" "It's my favourite," I blurted out, then instantly regretted it. I sounded like a breathless schoolgirl. I quickly gathered the remaining items and placed them back in the ripped bag, which he was now holding with a strained expression. "Thank you," he said, his voice still low, but with a hint of something else. Gratitude. I couldn't quite place it. "No problem," I mumbled, avoiding his gaze. I practically sprinted the rest of the way to work, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I'd helped him. I'd spoken to him. He read Jane Austen. But he was still the stranger next door. That evening, the crash happened. I was reading, trying to lose myself in a different story, but my concentration was completely shot. Every creak of the building, every rustle of leaves outside my window made me jump. Then I heard it, a loud crashing sound from 2B. It sounded like a bookcase falling or a body. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, my book slipping from my grasp. Images flashed through my mind. Mrs. Gable's warnings, Mr. Henderson's scowling description, the shadowy figure in the doorway. Something terrible has happened. I crept to my door and pressed my ear against it. I could hear nothing. No screams, no shouts for help, just an unnerving silence. My hand hovered over the doorknob. Should I check? Should I call someone? The building manager, maybe? Or the police? The thought of calling the police made me feel a wave of guilt. What if it was nothing? What if I was overreacting? I'd be wasting their time, and I'd look like a complete fool, and Mr. Silas would know it was me. I paced my apartment, wrestling with my conscience. Fear warred with a nagging sense of responsibility. What if he was hurt? What if he needed help? But the fear won. I did nothing. I went back to my book, but I couldn't read. I just sat there, staring at the pages, feeling like the worst kind of coward. The silence from next door was deafening, heavy with unspoken possibilities, and it was all my fault for letting my fear control me, it seemed. What would happen next? Next morning, I woke up with a crick in my neck and a heavy feeling in my chest. The guilt from the night before hadn't faded. I kept replaying the crash, the silence, my inaction. I had to do something. I decided I would at least try to talk to Mr. Silas. Maybe just a quick, "Good morning, everything all right?" as I passed his door. It wouldn't be much, but it would be better than nothing. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As I was getting ready for work, Leo, my ginger tabby cat, decided to stage an escape. He's usually quite well behaved, but he has a mischievous streak, especially when he senses I'm distracted. I was putting on my shoes, my mind still on Mr. Silas, when I heard a frantic meow and a scratching at the front door. I turned around just in time to see Leo squeeze through the slightly ajar door. I must not have closed it properly and dart into the hallway, and of course he ran straight towards 2B. My heart sank. Mr. Silas's door was open a crack. He was carrying a small overflowing trash bag, presumably heading to the bins outside. Leo, in his infinite feline wisdom, saw an open door and an opportunity for adventure. "Leo, no," I hissed, rushing into the hallway. It was too late. Leo had already slipped inside 2B. Panic surged through me. All my carefully constructed avoidance strategies, all my tiptoeing and breath-holding were undone in an instant. I imagined Mr. Silas, irritated, even angry, grabbing Leo roughly. Or worse, Leo getting hurt, lost in the mysterious depths of that apartment. I ran to his door, my apologies already forming on my lips. "Mr. wasn't scowling. He was smiling. A genuine, warm smile. The first one I'd ever seen on his face. And he was holding Leo, who was purring contentedly, nestled in his arms. He seems to have taken a liking to me, Mr. Silas said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He was stroking Leo's fur with a surprisingly delicate touch. I am so sorry, I stammered, feeling my face flush with embarrassment. He ran out. I didn't. It's quite all right, he said, his smile widening slightly. I like cats. I used to have one a long time ago. He continued to pet Leo, who was now rubbing his head against Mr. Silas's hand, clearly enjoying the attention. I stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do. Would you like to come in? Mr. Silas asked, gesturing with his head towards the interior of his apartment, just for a moment, to collect your adventurous friend. It was an invitation into the very place I'd been avoiding, the source of all my anxieties. But he was holding Leo, and he was smiling, and he seemed nice. Okay, I said, stepping inside, and that's when I saw it. Books everywhere. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, overflowing with books of all shapes and sizes. Hardcovers, paperbacks, old, new, some with worn spines, others looking pristine. There were books stacked on tables, on chairs, even on the floor. It was like stepping into a library, a secret, hidden world of stories. I gasped, forgetting all about Leo for a moment. Wow, I breathed. You have a lot of books. Mr. Silas chuckled, a warm rumbling sound. Yes, I suppose I do. I'm a bit of a collector. He gently placed Leo on the floor, and the cat, after a moment of hesitation, trotted back to me, rubbing against my legs. I work at a bookstore, I said, feeling a sudden connection, a shared passion. Bellwethers, down the street. Ah, Bellwethers, he said, his eyes lighting up. A fine establishment. I used to go there quite often before. He trailed off, a shadow passing over his face. Before, I prompted gently. Before my wife passed away, he said quietly. We both loved books. We used to spend hours browsing the shelves at Bellwethers. The pieces started to fall into place. The loneliness, the quiet, the scowling that was probably just sadness, the crash. Mr. Silas, I said, last night I heard a loud noise. I was worried. He smiled, a self-deprecating smile this time. Ah, yes, the great book avalanche. I'm afraid I'm not as organised as I used to be. A stack of books toppled over. Nothing broken, except perhaps my pride. Relief washed over me, so intense it almost made me weak. I had been so wrong, so completely, utterly wrong. I'm a retired English professor, he added, as if sensing my unspoken questions. Books are, well, they're my life. We stood there for a moment, surrounded by his books, a shared love of stories forming an invisible bridge between us. The stranger next door was no longer a stranger. He was Mr. Silas, a retired English professor, a widower, a cat lover, and a fellow book enthusiast. And I, Anna, the shy, anxious bookstore employee, had finally taken the first step towards getting to know him. What secrets did his book collection hold? That first meeting, sparked by Leo's adventurous spirit, was the beginning of a surprising and wonderful friendship. Over the next few weeks, I found myself spending more and more time in Mr. Silas's apartment. It wasn't just an apartment. It was a sanctuary, a haven for book lovers. We started small. I'd pop in after work, ostensibly to check on Leo, who had developed a fondness for napping on Mr. Silas's armchair, but really to talk. We'd discuss the books I was selling at Bellwether's, the ones he'd read decades ago, and the ones we both wished we had time to read. He told me stories about his wife, Eleanor. They had met in college, in a literature class, naturally. He described her with such warmth and affection, his eyes twinkling with the memories. He showed me pictures of her, a smiling woman with kind eyes and a mischievous grin. I could see why he missed her so much. One afternoon, I offered to help him organise his books. It was a daunting task, but I welcomed it. It was a chance to spend more time with him, and let's be honest, to be surrounded by all those glorious books. "Are you sure, Anna?" he asked, a hesitant look on his face. "It's quite a mess." "Of course," I said, perhaps a little too enthusiastically. "I love organising things, and I love books." And so we began. We started with one section, the classic literature shelf. We pulled down dusty volumes, carefully wiping them clean, and sorted them alphabetically. As we worked, Mr. Silas would pick up a book, his fingers tracing the worn spine, and tell me about it. Not just the plot, but the history, the author, the impact it had on him. He told me about the first time he read Wuthering Heights, how it had transported him to the wild moors of Yorkshire. He recounted the thrill of discovering Shakespeare, the beauty of Keats, the wisdom of Austen. It was like having a private literature lesson, a journey through the ages guided by a master storyteller. I, in turn, shared my own experiences with books. I told him about the joy of finding a hidden gem in a used bookstore, the comfort of rereading a favourite novel, the power of stories to connect us, to make us feel less alone. As we worked, the apartment felt less like a stranger's home and more like a shared space, a place of warmth, of knowledge, of friendship. The silence that had once been unsettling was now filled with the quiet rustle of pages, the soft murmur of our voices, the occasional purr of a contented cat. I realised how wrong I had been, how I had let gossip and fear cloud my judgment. I had almost missed out on this connection, on this friendship, because I had been afraid of the unknown. One evening, after we'd finished organising a particularly challenging section of poetry, Mr. Silas made tea. We sat in his armchairs, surrounded by the comforting presence of books, and sipped our tea in comfortable silence. "Thank you, Anna," he said, his voice soft, "for everything. For helping me with the books, for listening to my ramblings, for your company." "Thank you," I replied, meaning it with all my heart. I used to feel quite lonely, you know. I love my job and I love my books, but it's nice to have someone to share them with." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "Loneliness is a heavy burden," he said, "but it can be lifted, sometimes in the most unexpected ways." And it was true. A mischievous cat, a ripped grocery bag, a shared love of books. These were the unlikely threads that had woven together a friendship that had banished the shadows and filled the silence with something beautiful. The story ends with us, sitting there, two book lovers, a young woman and an older man, sharing stories and tea. The quiet hum of the apartment building fading into the background. The stranger next door was no longer a stranger. He was my friend, and I had learned a valuable lesson, that sometimes the greatest treasures are found where we least expect them, hidden behind doors we're too afraid to open. We must open our minds to reveal who and what is on the other side.